Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, welcome everyone. This is our fourth session of the Top Trends and Promising Strategies in Revenue Model and Funds Development series. So excited to see you all here, those who are returning and have come to previous sessions, those who this is your first session with us.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, there, now I got the notification. Thank you so much for being here. We're excited to see you all. So this fourth session is on the topic of revenue models, operating costs, and reserve funds. So you've had the pleasure of hearing from lots of various speakers, and we're excited to take you through this session on this topic today. But before we jump in, I wanted to cover some session logistics. So I repeat this at every session, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to share during today's meeting, please use the chat box. And it'd be great if everyone can start out by introducing themselves. So feel free to share your name, your organization, where you're joining us from in the chat. We can get a sense of who is all in this space. If you're experiencing technical issues during today's session, please try leaving the meeting and rejoining. However, if they do persist, as you heard, it is being recorded. So I am happy to share that recording with you afterwards so you can revisit. We also shared a worksheet in advance of today's session with some background materials. Feel free to use that to take notes during today's session or revisit afterwards if you want to take a look at any of the links included as part of those background materials. All right, as I mentioned, we've had the opportunity to hear from some incredible nonprofit professionals during this series. And for today's session, we have another wonderful lineup of folks here to share. So they'll all introduce themselves a bit further when it's time for their portions of today's session, but I'll just give a quick overview of who you can expect to hear from today. So we have Melodi, the Senior Manager of Advisory Services with Wegner CPAs. We have Kelly, the Chief Development Officer with Health Poverty Action USA. Lisa, Executive Director of Center for Community Stewardship. We have Jen, the Director of Development from Urban Ecology. And then Rachel, who is also from Urban Ecology and is the Director of Finance and Operations. So a really incredible lineup. We're so excited to have you all here and to hear more from you. But this is what we're doing today, and this is what we'll get started with, is an overview of the key concepts, and then we'll transition into this panel to hear from these incredible experts. That is your opportunity to ask questions, add things to the chat, and Mary Beth will be moderating that panel. So we'll make sure to get to your questions as we're going through with these incredible folks. I'm going to kick it over now to Melodi to get us started. And to take it away with her presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. This is great to be here. This has really been a very insightful series, and I've been enjoying it myself tremendously. As Jessica said, my name is Melodi Bunting. The easiest way to describe my experience is I'm old enough to have come full circle. I started with public accounting background. I'm a CPA and a few other credentials. Did that for a number of years, worked in private industry, but eventually I adopted 2 kids from India, and doing a single parenting, one of them has a muscle disease, necessitated me to be a little bit more creative with work. So I took on doing higher education and consulting. And that was a tremendous experience and ride for about 20 years. And once my daughter was pretty launched, I wanted to go back into more hands-on than just purely academic. And it just so happened Wegner was a firm I was familiar with, and they were excited about merging the backgrounds that I had. And I'm very fortunate to be able to work for a firm that supports the nonprofit community so heartily. And it has allowed me to spend a fair amount of time doing training and one-on-one client kind of work, and I really appreciate that. So I have been around for a while. I am not an expert in development, as many of you are, but I do know what I'm talking about when it comes from assessing business practices and seeing very many different models. So we're going to start off talking about this idea of a revenue model. In businesses, you often hear the term business model, as a way of describing how the business is set up. Obviously, for nonprofits, that revenue model is critical because that's what's going to fund the program. And it's different for a nonprofit because unlike a business where you primarily have a customer relationship, the nonprofit is dealing with donor and recipient relationships. So it is a different type of model and can be a little bit more challenging. The cool thing is that the funding space, as has been talked about in the previous sessions, has really been moving forward in seeing things differently. And that's very exciting because there's more models out there and more strategic ways to do this. And unfortunately, nonprofits haven't always had the opportunity to be strategic or tell their story or make the impact the same way. So it's exciting to see all of that slowly evolving here and things changing and flexing to the current circumstances. So what we're talking about here is assessing your funding streams. And the important thing is making those decisions. Now, obviously, as an accountant, I like the word strategic, so you're going to hear me probably say that. But the important point is that it is proactive. It's something we're thinking about in advance. And we're making intentional decisions around versus just trying to keep up with day-to-day operations. And we want the things that are going to provide the highest return for our mission and are the best fit. So that can be a number of different models. Social entrepreneurship is one of the areas that's been expanding now. And even that comes in different formats. I'm working with the traditional nonprofits that are primarily C3, C6s, et cetera. But these social entrepreneurships come in B3 formats, LC3 formats, et cetera. As I was doing some reading recently, this was a new one for me. Some of you may have heard it, but Love Your Melon started out with the TOMS model of buy one, give one for hats and related to childhood cancer and helping that community. They started as a C3 and in about 4 years of operations, they ultimately traded that model for a corporate model and set up a separate foundation. So they're just a great example of the landscape can continue to evolve and meet the needs of the given organizations and stakeholders and still accomplish that high impact towards mission. Another cool one that I've known about for a while is a local nonprofit here in Madison that has a bakery, and that bakery provides vocational training for individuals who've had some kind of past conviction situation. So they're combining different parts of their mission and creating models within their mission that allow them to actually make profits or sell products, in this case with the bakery. So this whole idea is, and the reason I brought up the Love Your Melon example, is this is not a static process. This is something that evolves with the changing marketplace, the changing needs of recipients, changing funders, et cetera. But it is important that we look at it strategically in terms of being the best fit, because not everything works for every organization, and that we're going to get the highest return. And we'll talk more about that, but not all funding is created equal. And then I just wanted to share this because this was over 10 years ago, and yet it highlights what we're still focusing on so significantly. In the 2009 Stanford Social Innovation Report, they quoted, "As society looks to the nonprofit sector and philanthropy to solve important problems, a realistic understanding of funding models is increasingly important to realizing those aspirations." And that's what we're going to discuss. And that is very true. Next slide, please, Jessica. So the first starting point is to do a revenue assessment. Now, this is kind of the high level, and we'll dive deeper into a few of these pieces. But one of the things you have to do is obviously identify the potential revenue streams. And we'll talk about a few more specifics here in a minute. But what we're ultimately trying to accomplish is creating a reliable revenue stream that's sustainable, cost effective, and it aligns with our mission. So that good fit. When you're doing this, oftentimes it can be an exercise that is limited to certain areas of the firm. But what I've seen through the years that I've worked with nonprofits is it's really great if at the point you're doing this revenue assessment, you can get feedback from multiple areas. What's working? What isn't? It's more than just the dollars in the door. There's more things to it. You want to create that optimal mix of revenue sources. And that's going to mean different things for different organizations. But two of the ways that I would look at it as an accountant is, one, I don't want a concentration. A concentration is something from my perspective as an accountant that goes on the financial statements to emphasize that there's a risk. In other words, we've put probably more than 30 to 40% of our eggs in one basket. So if that revenue stream ceases, there's a higher risk. So that's one of the ways I look at it. The other is in terms of balance. There is so much that can be balanced here to minimize risk and optimize return, and that's the idea. So we want to spread it out, but we don't want to spread it out so far that we're increasing administrative costs. And we want to make sure that the resources and streams that we're going after, again, are the right mix for our organization and fit with and align with our mission. The other thing that's true, and we'll talk about these other bullet points here on some of the upcoming slides, because there are different costs and restrictions, et cetera. But one of the things that's not on here is some of these require different expertise. And that's part of that best fit with your organization, because what you have as expertise in-house may speak very differently to different funding sources. And there's a communication issue that is really critical in finding that best relationship. And just that, it's relationships. Don did a great job in his presentation talking about how you earn the right to ask and having that relationship. And that's true in all of these different revenue sources, other than investment return potentially. The other ones are about those relationships that you build, and it becomes an important part of the DNA of the nonprofit. So we're going to look at all of those. Next slide, please. So here's some of the funding sources. Now, this is not necessarily an all exhaustive list, but what it should point out is that there are a number of ways that these organizations can obtain the funds they need to have the mission impact. Now, the one that we're most familiar with, obviously, is donations. But even if you look at just donations, there's a lot of nuances and differences here. Is it a major giver? Is it a smaller recurring giver? Is it a one-time giver? Is it gifts in kind? Is it from an estate or a legacy gift? All of those have different relationships and administrative costs that go with them. How you manage the relationship, the reporting requirements, the administrative requirements for documentation, et cetera, are all very different. So even within the donation realm, there can be a lot of things that we want to examine as part of this determining the optimal mix. Now, sponsorships can mean different things to different organizations. For C3s, a sponsorship generally meets the criteria to be treated as a donation, but there are specific criteria. Now, a C3 is the only one that can have tax-deductible donations. So other ones that have sponsorships are going to structure that as a slightly different revenue source because it's not considered a donation the same way it is for a C3. And that language can be a little confusing. You just have to make sure that you're clear on what it means to your organization. Grants can be private. They could be government contracts, the one that's right under it, and they could be for fees for service or donations. So grants and government contracts can come in a variety of scenarios. Again, there isn't just one size. And that's exciting in some ways because there's lots of opportunity and a lot of opportunities to make the best fit, but it also sometimes can be a little overwhelming. And that's where having the peer group and the communities come together and talk about best practices helps us sort through some of those opportunities that are out there. Now, another one that you hear a lot about is membership fees. Again, this is going to differ between a C3 or a charitable nonprofit versus some of the other ones like a C6, which is primarily a professional associations, or a C7, which is primarily social clubs. Membership fees means different things. In the associations and social clubs, it's a fee for service. You're getting something in return. For a lot of charitable C3s, it's more of a donation, but you have to look at each one because some C3s may be fee for service depending on how it's structured and worded. So one of the things that's really fun about my job is there isn't one answer. And I often joke, my favorite response to a question is, it depends, because I really have to know more. I have to know what the language is, what the intent is, etc. So membership fees is another example around that. Now, fundraising events also can be a huge variety of different things. We think traditionally of in-person events, but obviously COVID kind of shifted our thinking on that, and we realized that they can be in person. They could be peer-to-peer. My daughter keeps me abreast of things that I wouldn't normally have on my radar necessarily. And she has been involved in this great peer-to-peer fundraising event that I've learned a lot from. Some of you may know it. It's called Dresscember, where she wears a dress every day of December, posts on social media, and talks about why she's doing it. And it's related to trafficking and human rights. So it's a great way to have other people participating in that conversation. And do we lose the slides? Is that what it looks like? I'll keep talking and hopefully we'll get the slides back. There we go. Program fees are those things that from an accounting standpoint, we're looking at providing something in return. Accounting terminology, we use reciprocal agreement because the person is getting something. So when we host a fundraising event, let's say for a golf outing, that can be part program fees because it's for a golf event. It's an exchange transaction and also partly donation. So there's different ways to structure that. And the program fees may be from something that is part of the mission, but not the central part, like the bakery example that we talked about earlier. So those are just some of the things to look at. Investment returns, if you have endowments, that's a whole nother consideration. And then this last one, I'm not even going to talk about it extensively because this opens its own can of worms. But there's no reason a nonprofit can't pursue unrelated business income, even if you pay taxes on it. If you went through this assessment and determined that it's a reliable source that meets your mission and makes cost-effective sense, then go ahead. There's no reason not to. You just need to be aware of that. Now, you have to be aware of, like we talked about, the differences in relationship, but also the costs. And I want to talk about the costs next, of funding sources as well as the general operating costs. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. In terms of funding sources, there's differences in how we pursue them. The cost that you do to get an individual donor versus writing a grant or writing for a government contract. Do they come with restrictions? Are there certain reporting requirements? Some things like program costs could have sales tax potentially associated with them. Some of them may have unidentified risks. Some of the things that nonprofits sometimes get into, they don't realize have additional reporting requirements like games of chance or solicitation or charitable contributions in different states, etc. And there's opportunity costs because we can only pursue so much. So that's why it's important that we look at the costs and look at them holistically. So the operating costs include those costs of getting, retaining, and building the relationships with our revenue sources. But it also includes what we term as full cost, or sometimes I've heard the term true cost. And the important piece of this is that it includes everything that it takes to run the nonprofit organization. Too often in the past, nonprofits were evaluated strictly on that program percentage of costs. And while, yes, that helps maybe as one measure of fiscal accountability, it's really not an optimal measure. There is so much that is judgmental there, and so much that is not a black and white line, that it's important to understand the full cost and look at this broader. And that's been one of the really cool parts about listening to the prior presentations with this series, because that's where the dial is really moving, and funders are understanding that we need to fund for the current costs as well as the overhead cost. Not a bad word, overhead, it can be a good thing. And future costs. So that's an important piece. Now, allocations are a natural part of reporting for not-for-profits because we do want to understand, at least to a certain level, what's going towards program administration and fundraising. And because it's required on the 990, that's an essential piece. But those allocations can be different for different purposes. What's required for the 990 may be different than what a funder requires for allocation, or what some contract for program requires for allocations. So those allocations we treat so factual, when in reality, they can be very different for different purposes and very judgmental. One of the surprises when I'm teaching new accountants is their knowledge when they get the light bulb to come off to say, okay, just because this is in dollars does not mean it has bright lines and black and whites. There's a lot of judgment that goes into it. And so what we want to consider is what that allocation is designed for and what the intent behind it is. Also, we want to look at the administrative burden. What is the cost benefit? How much does it cost to retain and get this particular funding source? Is it continuing? Is it short term? What is it going to cost us to administer that work? And what is it going to help us do in building for the future? This has become even more critical, and we saw through COVID that a number of the organizations that were fairly stable and successful throughout COVID had that future orientation and actually had some reserves. So it is an important part of that long-term mission. It's not a short-term result, it's a long-term mission. And ultimately what we want to focus on is those outcomes. And the outcomes too often in the past have been more based on current activities because they were easier to measure than on the long-term meaningful change. So both in terms of funding and outcomes, we want to look at the longer horizon to understand the ongoing nature of the nonprofit versus the short-term impact. Next slide, please. So I use the term financial strength to encapsulate this, and it can be short-term and long-term. And it represents a number of things. In the short term, are we resilient? Can we recover quickly when something happens? As an accountant, we might look at what are our committed or fixed costs, because those are harder to flex or be resilient in the short term. Are we adaptable? Can we adjust to challenges and turn it into something positive? It was so fun to see organizations take COVID and run with it innovatively, not as a challenge, but as a positive. And it's really encouraging to see some of the great things that have come out of that. And then the sustainability. Can the mission be around long-term? So we don't want to have that short-sighted thinking when we're talking about various funding sources or the costs associated with them. And a critical piece of this whole puzzle of creating a revenue model and strength is the communication and collaboration. I'm seeing more and more collaboration going on between nonprofits and having them collaborate rather than sometimes in the past where they may have been more competing for some of the same dollars. So those are important elements to this as well. The one I'm also a firm believer in is transparency. Rather than just having percentages of program expenses versus fundraising expenses versus administrative expenses, to me, the way that you build that relationship with the revenue sources and you get that accountability is through transparency. So most of the organizations I work with, there's a portion of the website that is dedicated to talking about governance and how they're managing the organization, as well as sharing financial reports or 990s or other annual reports, etc. The idea being that we want to invite everyone into the discussion and we're not withholding information. And then an important part of this is reserves. That used to be such a nasty word, but more and more it's being seen as what it should be, as something that really helps us build for that future and have that sustainability. And reserves oftentimes are associated just with a short-term operating reserve. But it was really fun. Again, during COVID, we actually have worked with a couple of organizations that got huge gifts unexpectedly. And we've helped them create a reserve policy and different types of reserve. So you might have reserves for capital replacement. A food bank has to replace the forklifts and the freezers and refrigerators, etc. So we put away a capital reserve for that. We also worked with an organization that's social advocates, and they had some opportunities to potentially expand their mission. So we called one of their reserves an opportunity reserve so that they could invest in either capital expenditures or payroll or other things that could take advantage of those potential future opportunities. Next slide, please. And then as part of this transparency and just having the right information to do the strategic planning and decision-making, you need good information. And unfortunately, this is an area that hasn't always been a priority for nonprofits to invest in. But there's more tools now and it's more cost effective. And I've been doing a lot of needs assessment work with different organizations to determine what they really need to be able to do this well. Because if you have a strong financial planning and analysis tool or capability, you're going to be able to enhance your decision making and do some of the other things that are critical to making the most of your revenue sources, in monitoring the liquidity and evaluating the alternatives, etc. Another key thing with an FP&A tool is that we can do forecasting or scenario planning. So I'm working with a nonprofit right now that is doing scenario planning based on different programs they may expand into or different contracts they may accept. That brings a whole new level of decision-making and information to the table when we're doing the revenue modeling and assessment. So it's one of those things that, again, it's an important thing to look at. And then we want to measure that impact. So again, we can measure some short-term things really easily, but we have to make the push and the intention to hopefully measure a few things longer term so that we see that sustainability. And then it wouldn't be an accountant talking if I didn't talk about risks and opportunities. So when there's a risk, there's also an opportunity oftentimes. And part of having good planning tools and analysis tools are being able to proactively see that and respond versus being in reactive measure. My big takeaway from working with organization is when they plan well, they find the best fit. And when they're more proactive than reactive, they obviously have a much stronger impact because those pieces are funding and supporting the needs.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melodi. That was really wonderful to get us started for today. If you all have questions, feel free to add those to the chat. We are now going to transition into our panel. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Mary Beth to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I have had the privilege and benefit of hearing Melodi present and have her present in my classes many times before, but I always am so impressed by the way she's able to break down some of those key concepts in a way that many of us doing the work don't really get to step back and think about it very often in that way. And I think it's really beneficial, and I hope you all found it helpful as well. Now we're going to do something really fun, in my opinion, which is to dig in a little bit on what this revenue model construction and implementation looks like in real life organizations. And we have a really stellar panel, as Jessica referred to earlier. So try to facilitate across our panelists. Their names and images are up on the screen, and Jessica did introduce them earlier. And I'm going to do the thing that I usually think works better, which is to let them introduce themselves and their organizations in our first go round here. So what I'd like to kick us off with is just to have each of you, Kelly, Jen, Rachel, and Lisa, share who you are, what your professional background is, and what the organization is that you work with currently. And to the extent you're able to refer to it briefly, just a little bit about how your role relates to revenue models. And then in our next go round, we're going to get into like, what does this work look like for you? So for now, we can just do like the initial intro, but do make that connection for us of how does your job relate to the topic of today? So let's kick it off with, maybe we'll go Kelly first, furthest afield, and then we'll go to our Milwaukee duo at the Urban Ecology Center in order, and then we'll bring it home to Lisa, who's based in Madison. So Kelly, would you mind kicking us off?
Not at all. Hello, everyone. So my name is Kelly Douglas, and I work for an organization called Health Poverty Action, which is a global organization that focuses, been around for nearly 40 years, focusing on kind of what we do is that we act in solidarity with health workers, activists, and communities worldwide to improve health and challenge the causes of poverty and injustice. And effectively, that organization, my organization, has been around for about 40 years, but we just established an office in the US. So right now I'm based in London. And although I've lived most of my adult and professional working life in Madison, Wisconsin, had quite an epiphany and decided to uproot and move to London in the UK. So most of my background is working in nonprofits around Madison, Wisconsin, local community nonprofits, and decided to get a master's in London, and then decided that was too short to stay. So ended up finding a remarkable organization here. But Wisconsin keeps calling me back because we actually established our US office right in Madison, Wisconsin. So just a little bit more about the organization, just to introduce you to kind of what that actually means. One of the things that I found that I really gravitated towards with this organization is that we do what's needed, not what's easiest, to ensure that health is not being denied. So we're effectively working with some of the most marginalized groups globally, whether that's due to kind of remoteness or inaccessibility, even by their own governments, either in political or tribal conflict areas, or working with Indigenous peoples. We currently have projects in about 18 countries, mostly Eastern and Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And we have historically been headquartered in the UK, in London, which is where I am. And where I live, but spend a lot more time increasingly back in Madison. But we've really kind of taken heed with a lot of the criticisms and the analysis of so-called international development organizations, and really trying to decentralize even further than we already are, which effectively our local model is local leadership in each country, versus having everything and a lot of extra bureaucracy located and heavy levels of staff located in the UK. It's even more kind of global, where we've got board members and staff members really located, dotted all around the world. So My current position is, I have dual position as head of fundraising and sitting on the senior management team for the global health poverty action, and then also as chief development officer of Health Poverty Action USA. And so I'm making strategic decisions not only about the organization globally, but also actually have been the person spearheading starting a new organization in the US, which I've always had things quite beautifully organized for me when I stepped into my role. And now having to create that from scratch has been really interesting, seeing it from a different perspective. So hopefully I can share some of those experiences with you and hear more about what's interesting and how I can be helpful to all of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelly, and for joining us in the evening after regular business hours for you, I assume. So wonderful. We hope to stay connected with you as you bridge between London and Madison. So Jen and Rachel, I'm just going to invite the two of you to kind of share together a little bit about your respective roles at Urban Ecology. I'm really excited to have you both here today because I think we're going to get to address this question of development paired with finance internally. So with no further ado, tell us a little bit about yourselves and your respective roles at Urban Ecology. And I'm a huge fan of Urban Ecology Centers and I know a lot about them, but I'd love it if you could just share a little bit about what they are with our audiences as well.
Sure. So I'm Jen Hense. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Development at the UEC. Our mission is to connect people in cities to nature and each other, and we do that through our 3 environmental community centers in 3 really different neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And yeah, I think what I'm hoping to be able to share and talk about today is really the reason that when we were asked to be on the panel, Rachel and I said, we'll do it, but only if we can do it together, because this is, it's a team sport. And we're both heavily involved in putting together, you know, the planning, and I liked the future orientation that Melodi talked about. So we're, I think, are excited to share kind of how we tag team that and do that together. So turn it over to Rachel.
Yes, Jen said it perfectly. So my name's Rachel Nielsen. I spent most of my career in corporate America. I worked for a lot of Fortune 500 organizations before I joined the Urban Ecology Center here in Milwaukee. I'm pretty excited because I can use a lot of my corporate skills, but there's also a lot to learn about working in a nonprofit. So there's some that you can leverage and some that you have to learn new. But luckily, I do have a really great partner with Jen. And together, I think that it actually makes it work a lot better. So it's really exciting, and I'm excited to share what we've learned together with you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rachel and Jen. And last but not least, we have Lisa Dugdale here from the Center for Community Stewardship based in Madison, Wisconsin. So Lisa, I'd love it if you could share a little bit about your work with that really outstanding organization.
Yeah, great. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Lisa Dugdale. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Community Stewardship. We are a Wisconsin-based fiscal sponsorship. So fiscal sponsorship is an alternative to starting a 501c3. You can be under our 501c3, and we handle all the tax, legal, accounting, HR, all of the things that often are really challenging for startup and smaller organizations. So we currently work with 64 different organizations under our fiscal sponsorship banner, ranging from little tiny volunteer-led to 6 staff. So there's a wide range, but they are smaller and more grassroots. And my background is in starting organizations like that. And also I joke that I have master's degrees in nonprofit management, 2 of them, both of which were completely useless when I actually started nonprofit. So I really, because of my own experience, I really appreciate and like working with all of our startup organizations to help them figure out what their revenue model is and figure out how to hire staff and grow their organizations.
Great. Yes. And so I love that we have a global organization all the way to an organization that is supporting literally the very seedling level startups that will eventually grow, but need that advice, you know, when they're in their very beginnings. So let's go back through the same order. And this time I would like to ask you, and this is a hard question, but let's do our best. what does the work look like for you when it comes to constructing and implementing a revenue model for your organization? Obviously, each of you may have inherited certain things that you didn't get to begin from scratch, but I assume everyone here on this panel has thought through some of the considerations that Melodi spoke of, and maybe in a continuing iteration of what kind of a revenue model is optimal for your organization. But then also, I believe all of you have a role in actually like acting on that as well. So can you just talk a little bit about what that work looks like for you, assuming that probably across all four of you, it'll be a little different, starting with.
Sorry, it cut out there right at the end. Did you say me, Mary Beth?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes, I did.
Okay, good. So it's been interesting, not only kind of learning about fundraising and development in a global context, and specifically kind of based doing fundraising in the UK, which is actually quite significantly different from the US. But coming in and reviewing this organization that's been around for nearly 40 years. So looking at the kind of established revenue sources that we already have in place. So with our organizations, the largest population or the largest percentage of funding comes from government grants. And that is UK, US, and other kind of European, primarily European government grants. Also looking at kind of within the fundraising team, which I oversee, based in the UK, looking at trust foundations and corporate sponsorships, which are the large bulk. Looking at individual donors, so major donors, regular one-off, and legacy gifts, and as well as community and events. And basically assessing those kind of in an ongoing fashion, whether it's kind of annually when we're reevaluating and coming up with our annual budget to present to our board, and even quarterly to assess, what is the current environment, what things are happening. When you have a pandemic, obviously, everything shifts and you have to shift quite and adapt quite quickly and quite nimbly. So really taking the things that are already there into consideration and looking at how are we making these the best that we possibly can. So we have currently developed a practice, and this is something I definitely wanted to bring up, of ethical fundraising guidelines that we actually did a pretty extensive working group with our combination of our board and and staff, looking at how do we decide where we go for funding and who we accept funding from, and how we ensure that funding doesn't necessarily shift kind of how our practice or our values in how we approach our work. And so we're looking at return on investment, we're looking at the current landscape and environment, and also current opportunities. And we never want to be so kind of bogged down by a framework or a planning document that we don't stop and look for opportunities that come on. And so effectively what my team looks at is unrestricted funding. So we're looking for those opportunities that get us kind of untethered or non-earmarked funds so that we can adapt and we can react, whether it's a human-made disaster, climate change related disaster, whether it's a specific new project or a continuation of a project that needs funding, so that we can really kind of be nimble and react to what's needed most around the world. And so what we're currently looking into, I also wanted to bring some of these things up because I think they're really exciting funding, is looking at kind of the opportunities that have come up, looking at a global reevaluation of our full cost recovery process, which has been very interesting, and be happy to share more about that process and hear more from anybody who's been doing it at their own organization. Looking at really innovative sources of income. So how we're either investing our reserves or looking at social enterprise, looking at property investment, looking at research and consultancy partnerships, and then also expanding into new countries. So looking at, how we developed a new organization in the US to access different pots of funding, or coming up with local registrations, like we have a local development in Namibia. Basically just looking at how we effectively kind of adapt and find out what the greatest opportunities are within those different areas.
Beautiful. So really talking about that pie chart of what your different types of revenue might be, and which ones, as Melodi referred to, create an administrative burden or restrictions that may make them less appealing, looking at new opportunities. Yes. I love also that you brought up, if I can just reflect back on one thing, the notion of ethical fundraising, which I think raises something that wasn't part of our questions today, but is worth inserting here, which is not all gifts are things that every organization wants to accept for various reasons. So I know one thing we've talked about at the center with different organizations is having a gift acceptance policy or a way of reviewing gifts, because sometimes those opportunities that arise spontaneously can seem really lovely. Wow, we're going to get this donated property, or this funder really wants to do this project and they want us to be the ones to do it, but really analyzing whether that's going to fit in your proactive plan, and what strings are attached, whether those be ethical strings about associating yourself with an organization that doesn't have the same values as you, which we've seen a lot in our center, where people are iffy about taking sponsorships from like a corporation, that if they're an environmental organization and they're taking a sponsorship from a corporation that's a real bad actor in that space, that can be problematic reputationally. But also basic things like accepting a property that ends up costing more than it is worth, those are important things to note. Like, not all gifts are good gifts, right? Great. So that's a lot of food for thought. Your concept of recovering costs is something that sounds sophisticated and interesting, and I hope maybe we can get back to it. But let's keep moving through and talk to urban ecology colleagues about their pie chart, so to speak, of revenue models. I have found the Urban Ecology Center to be a Wisconsin nonprofit that does seem to have a compellingly diverse revenue portfolio between fee for service, rentals, donations, et cetera. And I'd love if you two, Jen and Rachel, could reflect a little bit on how you came up with that, or are working with what you inherited and how you analyze it and do the work.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. So just for context, for those of you who are new to the Urban Ecology Center, we're approximately $5.5–6 million a year in operating. And our the way that we break out our funding is about 20% of it comes from earned revenue or fees for associated with programming. And then we have a pretty diverse contributed revenue model. And in addition to that, we also have small pockets, much as Mary Beth indicated, of funding that involves facility rentals or other elements. And then we're also growing our endowment. And so the beauty of the endowment is that it should help provide a stable base that we don't have to go after every single year, but should provide a little bit of stability within fundraising moving forward. As we continue to move forward, some of these are going to shift, and we're going to look to diversify our portfolio even more. So since we only have 20% from earned revenue, we're looking to grow some of the other areas so that we're not dependent upon one specific area as we move forward with our with our mission. We do appreciate and look for ways that we can enhance our earned revenue, but in a way that does not exclude individuals from participating in our actual programming. So we are always looking for ways to strike that balance where we are earning revenue from folks who can afford it, but also not cutting off services to those who cannot, which continues to be a balance for us. Our contributed revenue portfolio, which Jen's team really drives, is incredibly diverse. And so I'll let her talk about it. But I think one of the nice things about the organization is that we are not dependent upon a single source of revenue. And they've really done a lot of work on that. So Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about the contributed revenue piece?
Sure. I think just tactically, if people are curious, the contributed revenue mix is about 40% from private foundations, 12% corporate grants, 6% government grants, which is actually a little bit higher than it has been for us in recent years. We have another maybe 10% in events, and then about 30% in individual giving. So I would note that we have more and more people who are as individual donors creating a foundation. So there's a little, back and forth between those. But that's what kind of the revenue mix looks like. And Rachel mentioned the endowment. I'm really excited about. We've created a legacy society over the past couple of years, and that's hard work to commit to, I think, sometimes, because I have annual goals that I need to meet right now, and creating a legacy society isn't actually really going to help me do that this year in most cases, but someone's going to be really glad that we did this work 10, 15, 20 years down the road as those commitments start coming in. So I think that's a really important place to spend some time when you look at your revenue mix. And then the other thing I'm going to say, that's maybe less about the revenue model specifically, but just about the approach for the organization, is making sure that those donor relationships don't just sit with one person. Ensuring that we have an incredibly charismatic and wonderful executive director. And 7 years ago, most of the donor relationships lived with him. And so when you get concerned about succession planning or someone getting hit by a bus, and Rachel knows our executive director happens to ride a unicycle, so the idea of him getting hit by a bus feels like, a little more realistic. But just making sure that we have transitioned those relationships, not necessarily away from him, but that there are other people in the organization that are also deeply connected to those donors, those foundations, those corporations, so that relationship building that we talked about, that's so important to continuing that contributed revenue stream, lives with lots of different people. So I think that's worth noting as well.
Very, very helpful insights. Love the idea of an on-the-ground organization, getting that endowment pie chart piece in place. Really quick before we move on to Lisa, Rachel and Jen, do you want to just refer for a moment to how you talk to each other in this work? I mean, Rachel's obviously handling the finance, like CFO more level stuff, and then Jen's more responsible for the development, but you said it's a team sport. So can you just mention, how does that work for you two?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say there's probably a fair amount of over communication, right? So here's something I see coming, and I want to let finance know that it's going to be happening. We are pretty good at, doing our monthly forecasts and ensuring that there is a heads up. I attend the finance committee meetings, but Rachel is the person on the hot seat, and I don't ever want to put her in a position where it looks like she didn't know that we weren't going to get that $175,000 grant, or that I don't want there to be any surprises. So I think that's a big piece of it, is just making sure that we're really upfront about, I just want to let you know, we had this conversation with the donor. Hopefully it all works out, but there's some risk here, and I want to be really upfront about that. And then I think our teams ensuring that we're aligned on where are we allocating the dollars and how is that coming in. I don't know. I'm not sure how it doesn't feel like competition or the back and forth. It just doesn't. And maybe we're just lucky, but I think it's important. It's been a good relationship to work on for sure. So I don't know, Rachel, if you have other thoughts.
No, I think you really said it, but then I think I also make sure that if our expenses are not landing where we expected them to land, Jen knows. I mean, like, she's probably my first or second call to say, like, what do you think about this? And what do you see? And where should we go? And what should we do? She's really like my partner in all of this, because in my mind, the transparency is really critical. There doesn't do the center any good if I'm holding all of the weight of the financials on my shoulders, because then you only have one brain trying to solve it and not everyone can contribute. Instead, the more of us that are aware of the status of the organization and where we are at any given point, the more people who can be working towards that common goal. And to me, we're all pretty sharp, right? But none of us is smart enough to do all of this by ourselves. It's just not possible. We're so much smarter when we work together. And so that's why there is just like a constant back and forth, or, hey, just so you know, this got pushed or this got pulled in. I don't know if you saw that, those sort of things. And just making sure that we're constantly communicating. And either of us, if a board member asked us any sort of financial question, I do think that while we do try to like hand things over that don't belong in our lanes, either one of us could speak intelligently to somebody about the financials of the organization. And that just makes working together so much easier.
And And I would just add to one of the things that Rachel and her team have done in the last year is create a financial acumen, financial knowledge series for our managers, so that they can also be talking to this, because again, it doesn't help if we get it at the top where, you know, people are confused about why decisions are being made. So that's been huge, to educate our full team of managers and help them to understand the budget is everyone's responsibility. They need to understand the inner workings of their department, and then how that reflects and impacts all the way up the chain.
Yeah, and I think this conversation really speaks to something that I think we don't talk about enough, maybe in the nonprofit field, which is there is a fluidity to this, which during COVID times in particular, I think that got opened up a little bit more into the conversation. But I mean, even when I teach students about budgeting at nonprofits, I'm always like, the optimal scenario is that you pass a realistic budget in the year that the board is aware of and knows about. And then you're basically just as staff, like implementing within those and coloring within the lines and going back to the board in the rare event that there's a need for a variation. But what you two are really referring to is a much more nuanced fluidity across maybe some of those like guidelines, and the need to be in touch about that as perhaps expenses change or revenues not coming in at the pace that you anticipated, which probably comes into play more the more diverse your revenue model is, even though that's a sign of strength, because the variables there are more variables, right, across all of those different categories. So thanks for highlighting that. I think that's really important for people to maybe be aware of. And I love that you're doing organization-wide training on this stuff, because another thing we see a lot of is this phenomenon of a lot of people want to like sort of put their head in the sand when it comes to financial stuff. And that's a real risk for any organization if like too many of the roles are depending on too few people to really know what's going on with the financials. Thanks for that. So Lisa, last but not least on this one, you're working with a lot of like early stage organizations. They probably don't have the kinds of options that we just heard Kelly, Jen, and Rachel talk about when it comes to their initial revenue model. But how do you advise them, or what kinds of successes or strategies are you seeing with that range of organizations that you're serving at this time when it comes to their revenue models and how they build them and implement?
Yeah, we're at the opposite end of the scale. So we often have people come in, maybe they're a founder, they've got a group of people, they have things that they're good at individually. They often come in, oh, I know some people who want to fund this. A foundation said they fund my work. They used to work with another nonprofit and they're going to fund this new thing. So they have a specific thing that they already have, which makes a lot of sense to get started, but obviously not as a sustainable organization. So and sometimes you get people that's a pretty good funding source, and it's been a good funding source for a while, but we know that it's not sustainable to not have that revenue mix or not have that cash flow if it's a government fund or something like that. So we really ask them some questions like, is this strategy working in terms of covering your costs? What are your long-term goals and what kind of funding will support those goals? Where are some pots of easy money that you're not taking advantage of? Who do you have easy access to? What group does your work put you in front of, or who you're partnering with? I mean, for instance, we had a group that had a lot of businesses that were partnering with them in their work, and they had just never asked for money because they had money coming in from other sources. But that's not something every nonprofit has. They had a real strength there that they were not taking advantage of. Because they just didn't know how to do that, and they had never really looked into that funding source. And then who supports your work or benefits from your work and also has access to funds? So let's say this is a strategy that the community development department has, and they're really trying to implement it, and you're doing a good job of it. They support that. They can find money. There are hidden pots of money. I always tell people a lot more places than people think there are when they're first starting. They think, oh, there's a funding cycle. You apply to the community foundation, you get it or you don't. No, I mean, we all know who people who've been doing this a while, that there are pots of money that are accessible that you can be proactive and go ahead and get. And we really recommend that people do some market research. Who is doing what you want to do? Like, let's say you think about where you want to be in 3 years. who's doing that, and especially nationally, because sometimes you don't want to be asking around locally. Who's doing that nationally? What does their revenue model look like? Is it 40% earned income, and you find that they have a certain program that always provides revenue that essentially subsidizes other programs? And it may be different what their program is, but you look at 5 centers doing what you want to do. What does that mix look like, and what are the common themes, and what can that teach you about what you want to do in your organization? And then we do a lot of coaching about how do you build that capacity, which I could go further, because that's a real challenge to do. If you're a grant writer, you're really excellent at writing grants, you know nothing about individual fundraising. It's a challenge to think about how do you build that capacity in your organization.
Great. I'm going to throw out 2 key terms or concepts to the whole panel and just see if you have any thoughts you'd like to share on them. One is, I think that we all think of this as sort of inherent to any revenue model, but other than Lisa's last comments, we haven't talked that much about grants. So would you just share anything you'd like to about how grants are continuing to play a role in your organizations? Our last session was on trust-based philanthropy and the way that we're hopefully seeing a lot of funders kind of remove some of the burdens and the onerous sort of requirements associated with grants. Even when they have burdens, I think we all still write grants. I mean, if they can support programming that we do, that's still going to be a promising component. So I'd love it if anybody could just chime in on grants. And then the other one that I would love to have you chime in on, if you're comfortable with it, is your rule of thumb about reserve or operating funds, whether you have a magic number for that, how you talk to funders about it. What are the conversations on your board about those 2 things? So I'm just going to open it up and see if we can sort of self-moderate with those 2 concepts.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about the grants a little bit. Certainly a significant piece of our revenue is coming through writing grants. We have spent a lot of time building relationships with as many of those funders as we can to be really open and transparent with them about the importance of unrestricted revenue. I love when Kelly said, like, that's all we're looking for. I mean, that would be a wonderful spot to be. But just to be asking, can you tell us more about why you need to know how many 4th graders came on Tuesday to the Washington Park location? Can you, and sometimes it's just been a really good conversation where they're saying like, is that hard information for you to get? It's very difficult. And so just having those conversations with them, I think I didn't hear the last presentation on the, the right, have we earned the right to ask? But I think it's the same thing. Have we earned the right to have kind of some of those difficult conversations with funders about, about unrestricting funds, about the power dynamics in funding? You could go on, but we're definitely trying to talk with people as much as we can. Our pipeline is robust in that we know what we think we're going to ask for, where we actually realistically think those dollars are going to come in, and what the gap is. And again, we are looking every month, we are probably looking every day at what those dollars are looking like and what the relationships with funders are, how they're evolving. So I think that's us on the grant side.
And I'll say, I think for our organizations, grants are actually a fairly important part of the revenue mix, maybe more than some other organizations, because I think we need to kind of talk about equity here, because I think we're talking about individual donations, there's unequal access. So a lot of our organizations don't have access easily. They can build it, but they're not coming in with a set of knowing a whole bunch of people who have a whole bunch of money to give. And so they're looking at grants, and that is a really important part of it. And we're really lucky to have grantors who understand that and give unrestricted funds to a lot of our organizations. That said, we've also got a lot of reimbursable government grants. So there's a cash flow issue there. But I think because funders tend to know our organizations are startup organizations and they're doing really vitally needed work in the community, we get a lot of unrestricted funds for our organizations. They're smaller, but they're really essential. And I think that has enabled people to grow and to build the capacity to get some additional types of funding to balance that revenue mix.
I can second a lot of what Jen and Lisa have already said, and think it's grants are a pretty substantial part of our income structure. The only thing I wanted to add, and somewhat idealistic, but somewhat realistic, is also kind of the ongoing, when you have an ongoing trust and a partnership where there is communication back and forth, being really honest about the barriers you face, the kind of process, and the kind of, at times, undue stress of getting information, getting data, and feeding that back to the donor. There was one example of a trust, a foundation, who reevaluated all of their processes over the pandemic to try to make it less burdensome for the charity that they're working with. And so we played a role in giving feedback, which I wish more donors would go through this process, and where you're getting the information you need to keep investors, trustees happy, but also recognize kind of the best use of time. Or we have a corporate partner who just says, we don't want you to pull together a bunch of information for us. Use this where it's needed most. What we want is for you to show us how it's making an impact. And so really getting to the crux, because people want to see how they're making a difference. So how, if you build trust, and if they understand your model, if they understand how much that we're pretty lean on operating fronts. If you would have, before lockdown, we had an office in London that is the ugliest office I've ever worked in. And it was clear that we were not investing a lot of resources in our setup, because my CEO will always say, the income that we get is kind of property of the communities we work with globally. And so we want to spend that really wisely. And so, people know that we're quite lean, and so that they understand what we're doing. It was a great bargaining tool having people come into the office and see, but now we actually got rid of our office because it felt a little gratuitous, having an expensive central London office when we have so much work and so many staff and trustees being kind of located globally. So having a kind of relationship where there is that exchange of information, where we're understanding how to better negotiate with donors and have the kind of data that backs that up, so that they can understand and build trust with us as well.
Beautiful. Well, it feels very perfect to maybe turn to Rachel to talk about reserves and operating costs and how we quantify all of that and deal with that. Sort of used to be a dirty word, but now we're trying to get more into the place of embracing it as a part of the reality.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So our organization works with the finance committee to determine the status of several reserves that we've set up over the course of the years. One of them is the operating reserve, and that's essentially supposed to be our rainy day fund if something were to happen. That way we can always hit payroll, et cetera, et cetera. That we target to be between about 90 and 120 days of our operating budget. We do have some bankers on our finance committee who would love to see that be larger. But the point is that for most of the organization, we really want to make sure that dollars that are coming in are being used for the services and that we're providing to the community and to help further the mission. So having 90 to 100, and so we've made this balance of like how much is enough, and then how much also does not overburden the actual raising of revenue to actually just like park the funds. Where can we make sure that we are using the funds that we're raising to further the mission? In addition to an operating reserve, we also have 3 buildings that we are responsible for. So when we do capital campaigns, we do put away funds for reserves for those buildings, so that if we need to replace the roof, or if the water cistern goes out, or things of that nature, we do have a significant pool that we can pull from. And then finally, we also have one aspect of our mission that's really interesting, is that when we do field trips with schools, we do not ask the schools to provide their own transportation. Instead, we provide transportation through buses that go to the schools within the 2-mile radius of our centers, pick up the kids and bring them back. But that means that we also own a fleet of buses. And so the buses also have a reserve for them, so that we can replace the buses on a cadence and make sure that we do still not interrupt any kind of service or impact the school or the children. Instead, we have the buses that we need. And buses, I never knew anything about buses before I joined this organization, but they have a very long lead time and they take a very long time to order. So you need to make sure that you are on top of it. And if your bus is starting to act a little squirrely, like you need to make sure that you are actually on top of it, repairing it, and then also making a plan to order a new bus. So those are the things I've learned here, but those are the 3 reserves that we have. And that's the methodology that we have for the 3 buses, or for the 3 reserves, excuse me.
Mhm. I really want to get to our questions that have come in the chat, but real quick, and we could even maybe put this in the chat with everyone involved. Is anybody trying to stick to like a special magic percentage when it comes to operating costs or overhead costs? And this might be one for Melodi too. Just, I feel like that I've seen various numbers in my career, and I would like to think we could get away from that a little bit, but maybe just rapid fire. Anybody got a number in mind when they're trying to quantify that or how they talk about it?
When the accounting profession adopted the new standards and defined better what some of the actual expenses should be, the general thinking was programs should be somewhere between 70 and 80.
And then fundraising and operations or overhead taking up the remaining 20 to 30%. Yeah. And I think I'm speaking to a very well-informed audience, but I mean, I think the other interesting thing about overhead or operating is that it's all about how you label and divide certain things. So there are salaries that can be divided in various ways across all 3 of those categories and the like, and being proactive with your accounting professional is probably as important of a tip as anything, right? Okay, well, if anybody has percentages they want to throw in the chat, including our panelists, or like thoughts on this, feel free to put them in there, but I want to make sure we get to some of these questions from the audience. So I am going up in the chat and I'm going to just kind of go through these. And again, everybody's been doing such a great job self-moderating that I'm going to just invite you to chime in as you see fit. So the first question we had is, who typically owns the process of evaluating revenue streams for an organization? And I guess you can all speak from your experience on this. You've talked about it a little bit, but anything to add about who sort of gets involved with that? You know, is it your finance committee? Is it your board? Is it your CFO? This should be a pretty quick one, just bouncing off of what we've already talked about.
I can step in quickly. So we operate with as minimal bureaucracy as humanly possible. And so that's kind of one of the fundamental aspects of our work. Some ways phenomenal, in some ways makes things complicated. So we operate as a senior management team largely, and where the people overseeing, so my colleagues within my cohort have oversee programs in specific kind of areas of the world. And they really kind of feed into the kind of not only the operating costs, but the income and ways we're getting income in those areas. Where fundraising, I largely oversee and am making the decisions. And I think we're guided by our trustees. And we have really amazing experts and expertise and insight. But where we have a lot of ownership as the senior management team to be making some of those decisions, most of those decisions.
I would just chime in that with some of the nonprofits that I work with, we're seeing it become more than just a leadership piece. And it's going to depend on the structure and composition of the organization, because to Kelly's point, different structures are needed for different organizations. But one of the things we've been really emphasizing is that the finance piece is not just the accountant or development. I mean, it really is throughout the organization, and we all have a piece of that somehow and in some relevant way. So when you can make it, when it's appropriate administratively, broader, I've seen some great organizations actually doing zero-based budgeting and incorporating the whole team, the whole organization on having some of these conversations.
Right. Like when you think about fee for service, if you're running a youth camp in the summer, I mean, the CFO can't sit in their office and determine like what the appropriate number of kids or fee basis would be for that, right? Like you got to have the programs people involved. Anybody else have anything to add to that one? I think it's fair to say that for the organizations of the size that Lisa's dealing with, it's probably often the executive director alone starting out to make those, or the founder, and then, yeah.
It's near impossible if you're talking about an organization that is doubling in size every year or goes from 30,000 to 100. I mean, it's just operating reserve. I mean, yeah, it's just a very, even Center for Community Stewardship has doubled every single year. So trying to figure out how to budget there and figure out appropriate operating reserves, which have gone up and up every year, is a challenge.
Right. Like it's fair to assume it will be triage based in the beginning stages, and that would probably be one person or a couple of people sort of figuring that out as you go. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the next question here. How aggressively, any rules of thumb about how aggressively to budget out the growth of a new revenue line? I assume it somewhat depends on the type of revenue line, but the question is, like, if you were adding a new revenue line and trying to plan for its growth, how should you plan the growth trajectory?
I could start this one. So I often say that in finance, our job is not only to manage the numbers, but to also like manage the personalities. So it matters who is actually thinking about this revenue growth. You might have somebody who is like, all the things, it's going to be super successful. All the things are going to align. It's going to be amazing. And then as the finance person, my job is to like mentally discount that growth rate. Or I might have someone who's like, oh, we could do it, but we're going to have to, you know, this is a risk and this is, and so then my job is to be like, yep, I got you. And I'm going to bump you up just a little bit, just because I know the personalities of the individuals behind it. I would say that accepting the uncertainty of it is just part of the job, and understanding like your goal will be not necessarily to get the perfect number, but to reduce the cone of uncertainty as you gain more information about those revenue streams. And that will help you get more. The more you learn, the better you'll be at predicting it. And the only thing you know when you're predicting things is that you're wrong. It's just a matter of like reducing the number that you're wrong, reducing the variability of it.
Yeah. And I love that you come to that perspective and the fluidity of it also from corporate America, Rachel, because I feel like when I think about the way that very large businesses that have huge obligations to shareholders and everything do their budgets, nobody expects them to understand what the whole year is going to look like. It's a constant flow of like how the business is running, and the nonprofit sector, I think it's different, but there is some reality of that, like getting comfortable with uncertainty that I think probably needs to come into play to be risk-taking and creative and innovative as well. Great. So the last question we had is one that I would have asked anyway to wrap us up, so it works out perfectly. Any anecdotes or examples you'd like to share of like super promising or fun revenue strategies or sources that you've pursued or seen other organizations pursue that you want to kind of highlight, that had good return on investment or grew quickly or were easy or fun, you know, all just anything positive, sort of some fun, positive examples to land on here. Anybody have any?
This is not exactly answering the question, but I think your best ROI on the fund development side is making sure that you are stewarding your donors. One of our mottos at the Urban Ecology Center and our development team is to thank the hell out of our donors. We want them to have never given a gift to an organization like and then feel, have felt as thanked as they did for what they're doing for us. So I think you can put together the model, you can do all of the work. You can say, I think this is what someone's going to give. You can send in the grant, all of those things. But if you don't take the time to steward that relationship and that donor, it is going to make it harder and harder every year for you to predict your revenue, because people aren't going to come back, and you're going to spend a lot of time chasing lapsed donors instead of continuing to build and ask the donors that you have now to support you in bigger and deeper ways. So that would be my development slant on the question.
If I can just like tack on to what Jen said, an example of something that her team has implemented is that one afternoon in February, when we're all like, it's all kind of dreary and gray, right? The entire organization stops what it's doing, breaks up into cross-functional teams, and goes out into the community and delivers a little thank you gift to donors, to our biggest donors, and just says, and one of the unexpected benefits of that is not only do the teams like cross-functionally just sort of hang out and do something casual, but also everybody sees who's actually funding the organization at that point. And so whether you're an educator who normally works with the kids, now all of a sudden you're face-to-face with the foundation that's actually paying your paycheck to make sure that those children can come out into nature in the middle of the school day. So I think that's something where she has found a way to incorporate the entire organization into the thanking, not just the development team. It's been super powerful.
Brilliant strategy. And the foundations and funders get to see those educators too, which is pretty special. Great. Lisa or Kelly, any fabulous anecdotes or illustrations you'd like to share?
Just quickly, which is not a quick conversation, but the process that I alluded to in really switching the mindset around full cost recovery for a global organization that has nearly 400 staff globally. And really trying to kind of figure out, it was quite a puzzle piece to figure out. So I wouldn't say it's come to fruition yet, but just trying to identify what the challenges were with making it happen and kind of piece by piece breaking that down. And with so many different moving pieces has been, really a challenge, but one that I think we're kind of knocking out as we go. And I think overall could have it could be a complete game changer for the sustainability of our organization. So that dangling carrot of knowing what a big deal it could be to kind of shift where we are, the current percentage of operating, current operating rate that we're at, and versus where we want to be, could be completely change the course of our organization's future.
Beautiful. And because that is a thought-provoking piece, I think what I'll do after today's session is look for maybe a background article or something, and maybe Kelly, I can collaborate with you to send out or put in the background materials for this course. Lisa, any great examples you'd like to share?
Yeah, we've been really trying to ourselves personally and with our organization to work with supportive funders to ask them for help, particularly because they know they're startup organizations and they know they don't necessarily have connections. So if there are people who are excited about your work, we'll go to them. Maybe they give you a little bit of money, but a lot of them, they know other funders. They know they can connect you to folks. So just say, hey, listen, it's what we're hoping to do. You have some proactive document, with not all organizations necessarily even do. And then you ask them to connect you and to work with you as partners instead of just give me some money and go away. But no, I know you support our work. Can you help connect our organization to other funders or other people who might support us in a wide variety of ways?
I love that you're ending with that for us, Lisa, because another thing we hear from funders all the time is they themselves feel an urge to know that those organizations that they're funding have sustainable revenue models. They want to know that they're not going to be the sole source that's coming through for this organization till kingdom come. And so I love the idea of then engaging them with that. Like, how can we diversify our revenue model and be more sustainable so that your gift to us for 3 years running isn't our only bread and butter? So love that. Wonderful points all. Thank you all so much. This has been just a rich and really sophisticated conversation. People that think nonprofit work is not complex and just as sophisticated as the business world are totally wrong. Thank you for all that you do for these amazing missions you work on. And I'm going to have Jessica Fisher bring us home a little bit and give us an outro poll and forecast next session. But we will all be in touch. Thanks for being friends of the Commons. And I enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Beth, and thank you to everyone on the panel and Melodi for your presentation. And thank you all for joining us. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. It's just 3 questions to gauge how you felt today's session went. As I've mentioned before, this is our first time running this virtual series, so it's really helpful to get your feedback on how things are going so we can continue to improve and offer this in the future. If you are not signed up for the full series, but you are interested in attending some of our future sessions, I'm dropping a link in the chat where you can find out more about some of the upcoming. We have 3 more sessions as a part of this series. And I'm also gonna close us out by sharing my screen that previews what you can expect next. So we have next week off. There is no session next week Tuesday, but then the following Tuesday, September 13th, we are going over tactics for revenue models and fundraising plans. So really getting in that nitty gritty and the tactics and to-dos there. So we hope to see you there. Feel free to register if you're not registered already. And thank you all again for being here. Bye, everyone.